Oh, pardon me, excuse me. Hello and welcome to the Shakey Sonnet Show. Here we are in the Sonnetarium at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainders section of an unnamed local library which may or may not have a lion couchant or two patrolling the premises so that no one can either come in or go out without a note from their supervisor. So here we are. Truth is, I'm all fagged out. I don't know. Do you ever have that feeling when you're worn and weary and the world, which we all know is filled with wonder, seems to be keeping all that wonder under wraps, and you look around and nothing. Everything is just a dull, dreary dud. And you look for diversion in all the usual places, like Sergio's deep, dark eyes, for instance, when he's anywhere to be found. And when he's not, at the bottom of another martini glass, perhaps, or the bottom of the second bottle of wine. And still nothing. It's quite sad. So you think to yourself, I know Shakespeare sonnets, and you go to your handy-dandy sonnet book and you look for the next sonnet, which is Sonnet 11, and you just think, oy vey, what? I mean, Sonnet 11 isn't going to do it for anyone, but you've promised to present every last one of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets, and Sonnet 11 is right there in the middle, or in the middle of the beginning, or the beginning of the beginning, or in the middle of nothing, it appears. So you put on your glitter dress and your feathers, and you forge ahead. Even though Sonnet 11, let's face it, just is not very interesting. So this is actually probably a good time to address the topic, what makes a poem interesting? So I go to find out how do we look at beauty, and I found this book by Elaine Scarry on beauty and being just, and she's a philosopher and an aesthetician, or maybe not quite an aesthetician, I think that's probably the wrong word. The last time I encountered an aesthetician, she took one look at me and said, "Oh, honey," and turned heel and ran screaming out the door. So I don't think Elaine Scarry is an aesthetician. She's the Walter M. Cabot, or Cabot, Professor of Aesthetics at Harvard University. And this is her book on beauty and being just. And in here, she says that beauty is in the particular, which we'll see next week when we look at Sonnet 12. This week, we've got Sonnet 11, and there's nothing in Sonnet 11 that gives us any beauty in the form of particulars. It's all abstractions and generalities, and the only thing that we really do learn, if we really believe that this is somewhat autobiographical, the only thing we really do learn is that Shakespeare is a bit of a size queen, and I hate size queens, although I almost always love their boyfriends. But let's get to the sonnet. See if I can keep the feathers out of my lips for just a short time, and we'll look at whatever particulars there may be in Sonnet 11. 11. And once we dispense with that, we'll realize that because there are no particulars to really hang anything onto or hang on to for us, we'll go straight to the gossip. Because I can quite understand how when you get a poem like Sonnet 11, you think, well, there must be something more that's going on here than meets the eye. And so you dig into all the details and you concoct whatever stories you can to stimulate yourself, because Sonnet 11 just isn't doing it. But let's read through it. We'll get the general sense of what's going on, and then we'll then we'll get into the gossip, the good stuff. Sonnet 11. As fast as thou shalt wane, so fast thou growst in one of thine from that which thou departest. And that fresh blood which youngly thou bestowest, thou may call thine, when thou from youth convertest. Herein lives wisdom, beauty, and increase. Without this, folly, age, and cold decay. If all were minded so, the times should cease, and 80 years would make the world away. Let those whom nature hath not made for store, harsh, featureless, and rude, barrenly perish. Look, whom she best endowed, she gave the more, which bounteous gift thou shouldst in bounty cherish. She carved thee for her seal, and meant thereby thou shouldst print more, not let that copy die. Well, here we go again. It is, guess what? A sonnet meant to put forth the idea that you must give the effort to procreation and give it a good old college try and populate the world with your beauty. And we'll go through it line by line and just tell you exactly what is happening. As fast as thou shalt wane, waning, like the waxing and the waning of the moon, as fast as thou shalt wane, so fast thou growst in one of thine from that which thou departest. Now, there are a couple ways of looking at this, and if you have a really good dirty mind like I do, you would imagine that this is actually possibly a description of impregnation, tumescence and detumescence. As soon as you grow limp, so fast someone else grows from that which you've just departed. So, I mean, do you need a graphic? There's a little embryo in there, little detumescence going on. As fast as thou shalt wane, so fast thou growst in one of thine from that which thou departest. So, possibly there's an embryo, possibly there's a vagina. There seems to be a penis involved, so hooray for that. Always a hooray for a nice penis. And that fresh blood which youngly thou bestowest, well, you've just impregnated some girl, and there's an embryo growing. That fresh blood which youngly thou bestowest, thou mayst call thine, when thou from youth convertest. When you grow older, you can call this baby yours. This baby will grow up, be a handsome young man if he's lucky enough to be a man and carry on the tradition, because the women aren't bestowed with the names of houses or titles, etc. It's the male child who has all the luck, even if you have 10 daughters and 1 boy, the boy is the one who gets all the inheritance. Not fair, but this is Shakespeare's time. So Shakespeare's saying, impregnate someone, you'll have someone that you can call your own. Herein, he pats himself on the back, herein lives wisdom, beauty, and increase. If you do this, you're wise, you're beautiful, your store will increase. Without this, folly, age, and cold decay. If you don't have children, it's foolish, you'll grow old, you'll die, you'll have nothing to show for yourself. If all were minded so, the times should cease, and 80 years would make the world away. A score is 20 years, so 80 years would be 60 years. If everybody thought like you did and refused to procreate, the entire world would disappear, because after 60 years, you'll die, and then what? What? Nothing. Nothing. Big fat nothing. Big fat goose egg for everybody. The entire world will disappear, and it'll be all your fault. In the third quatrain, he pounds his point home a little bit more, even though he's already made it. Let those whom nature hath not made for store. So, for store, in other words, to keep or to save. If you store something up, you are keeping it for a rainy day, or you're storing your jewels in the basement, or you're keeping something that is going to be used. Let those whom nature hath not made for store. And those people, according to Shakespeare, are harsh, featureless, meaning that not that they're Voldemort with no nose or whatever, but simply that there are no features on their face that are remarkable in any way, that marks them out as beautiful, that marks them out as special, that marks them out in any way recognizable. They're featureless. They're just a bland, dull blah. Harsh, featureless, and rude, meaning, you know, they didn't have time to sit in front of the makeup mirror and just, you know, put a little extra effort in, a little glitter here, a little mascara there. No, they're rude. They walk out into the street, curlers in their hair and slippers on their feet, and they don't care. They're in the middle of the supermarket, but who cares? They're rude and featureless and harsh. Let them barrenly perish. Let them die without children, because we don't want any more of those people hanging around. Look, whom she best endowed, she gave the more. Okay, there we go. Pretty clear. Which bounteous gift thou shouldst in bounty cherish. And if you need help, just give me a call. She carved thee for her seal. And a seal, think of a queen's or a king's ring with the royal seal on it, and you dip it in wax and you make an imprint and say it's the picture of Queen Elizabeth or King James I, and you, or whatever young lad fancies himself enough to make a seal of his own face on it. Print that in the wax. It's a copy that looks just like you, even better though because it's live. She carved thee for her seal, and meant thereby thou shouldst print more, not let that copy die. Okay, we get it. Well, as I said, it's generalities and abstractions rather than particulars. Wisdom, beauty, increase. We know what they mean, but you can't really form a complete picture. Folly, age, and cold decay. All right, we get that too. Harsh, featureless, and rude. The best thing in this is the look whom she best endowed and gave them more. It gives us a sense of what we might be talking about, even if it's not really what Shakespeare had in mind, and maybe if it's just some old queen with a dirty mind. It's something to hang our hats on. So, speaking of something to hang our hats on, I have, by the way, found, before we go further, well, let's talk about for a moment a new version of the sonnets, which, if you're going to follow along, perhaps these should be the sonnets. The Penguin. I don't know why I didn't think of this to begin with, but this version is actually much better than the Signet Classic. It's about the same size. It's just as easy to carry around. It doesn't have any of the errors that I consistently find in both the Signet Classic versions. And one thing I also do like about it is that each sonnet is clearly written in full on each page. Some of these editions of the sonnets break the poems up so that you start on one page and go on the next, which is very difficult if you're trying to memorize them. It's good to have it all on the same page. Now, let's get to the gossip. If it's true, if we're indulging the idea that Shakespeare had the horn for some young lad and he was somehow commissioned to write these, or if he was perhaps by his own strong emotions impelled to write these sonnets to this young lad, who might this young lad be? Well, the first that we'll consider is Henry Wriothesley, or sometimes called Roseley. Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, who was born in 1573 and died in 1624. And people sometimes think that it was Henry Wriothesley because Wriothesley, the way that it's spelled, is sometimes, people said in Shakespearean times, pronounced Roseley. So they believe that maybe he was the Rose of Sonnet 1. Remember, that was capitalized and in italics. Thereby beauty's rose might never die. Also, in Sonnet 3, if we look at another portrait of Henry Wriothesley and then look at a portrait of his mother and think about Sonnet 3, which says, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime," you can see when you see the two, young Henry Wriothesley and his mother, they look quite similar, and who knows, maybe they even wore the same dress size. I don't know, but it looks likely. Another picture from later in his life does indeed show him to be quite a looker, so I could go for that. If Henry Wriothesley was indeed the object of the Procreation Sonnets, which most people do doubt because he was a noble person, and it's not likely that Shakespeare would have dedicated something in such a way in the language in which he dedicated the 1609 quarto to a Mr. W.H. It's not likely that he would be called Mr. because he was a noble person. But if Henry Wriothesley was indeed the object of the Procreation Sonnets, then Shakespeare did a good job, because Henry Wriothesley did do his duty and did beget children and did beget a son who became the 4th Earl of Southampton. And he had children, but alas, they were all girls. And when the 4th Earl of Southampton died, the title, the Earl of Southampton, died with him in 1667. Although he did have daughters, and one of those daughters married into the Spencer family, which over generation after generation after generation, created Lady Diana Spencer, who's the mother of our William and Harry. And if things go the way people expect them to go, perhaps Henry Wriothesley will have spawned in some way or another the next king of England. Who knows? So, yay, procreation. Sometimes I guess it pays off. So, the next subject is, let's see, William Herbert, the 3rd Earl of Pembroke. Apparently Shakespeare had a thing for 3rd Earls. William Herbert, who actually his initials are W.H., so he fits a little bit more easily into the suspicion pool. William Herbert, 3rd Earl of Pembroke, born in 1580, died in 1630. And there are a couple portraits of William Herbert, the 3rd Earl of Pembroke. And if we're being shallow and superficial, which of course we are, not my cup of tea necessarily, but he also did his job, that 3rd Earl of Pembroke, and created this person, William Herbert, the 10th Earl of Pembroke, which, I mean, I could go for that. In fact, It's true. I once tried to cozy up to the 10th Earl by attempting to convince him that perhaps we were kissing cousins. Perhaps in my line there's some royalty, but turns out he likes a real lady. And after the investigation, once the restraining order was cleared, they found that indeed I have no Pembrokes in my lineage. There is a was broke, there is an is broken, there's a still broke, but alack and alas, no Pembroke. Quel dommage. Mais it happens. So we move on to a third suspect, but not really a third suspect. Our dear, dirty Oscar Wilde wrote The Portrait of Mr. W.H., and you can look at the title page, I'm going to set that over there, of the 1609 version and see that the inscription or the dedication says, "To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness, and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet, wisheth the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth. T.T." So Oscar Wilde, in his story or novella of Mr. W.H., has his narrator concoct this idea that W.H. is actually a young actor named Willie Hughes who was in Shakespeare's company, and hilarity ensues. But it's actually quite an interesting book if you're into the sonnets, because he, as the narrator builds his argument, he takes from the sonnets and builds his point as he goes along. So it's really quite a diverting read. Diverting, yes. Entertaining, yes. Amusing, yes. Convincing, no, not at all. In fact, this Mr. W.H., which has been talked about over and over and over, may have been solved. The fact that it's Mr. W.H. means that it was not a noble person, or it probably was not a noble person. And there's a researcher named Geoffrey Cavney, who hypothesizes, and after doing extensive research, believes that it was a man named William Home, who is a publisher and a contemporary publisher of Thomas Thorpe, who did publish the 1609 quarto. And the format of this inscription is similar to a funerary type of inscription that were found on Roman graves. And he believes, this Geoffrey Cavney believes, that Thomas Thorpe actually wrote this inscription for his friend who had just died, and possibly that the manuscript of the sonnets were found among William Holmes' effects, and that Thomas Thorpe, having found these, which wouldn't have been unusual, decides to print them and dedicates it to his recently departed friend, William Home. And that's a pretty good theory. It sounds good. There was, in fact, a William Home who was a publisher who died before this came out, and no less than Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells in this book, which I just got. So I can't really speak too much about it, but in this book they do consider it a plausible theory. So we'll go with that for now. The fourth most interesting theory comes from another book, again from Elaine Scarry. And I also just got this book, so I can't speak too much on it, but she believes that the young man might be the poet Henry Constable. This book is called Naming Thy Name, Crosstalk in Shakespeare's Sonnets. And there is a poet named Henry Constable who, as she goes forward, she looks at Constable's poems, I think, and she looks at Shakespeare's poems, and she makes, I'm on page 12, so I can't really talk too much about it, but she makes kind of a pretty good case, or she begins to make a good case that Henry Constable's name actually appears in some of the lines in Shakespeare's sonnets. So Henry Constable was born in 1562 and died in 1613. And while I couldn't find a convincing or an accurate or even like any kind of a portrait for Henry Constable anywhere, I did find, while trolling through the internet picture gallery for rough trade, RUFF, as one does, I did find this picture. And, well, my goodness, that picture has tossed me off to sleep more times than is ladylike to mention. So I'm going to go with that version of rough trade for the Henry Constable, and I'll imagine that if indeed Shakespeare did write to a young man, that he may have looked something like that. And then I could understand, and I could almost forgive Sonnet 11 for being as abstract and general as it is. So what are we left with in the end of Sonnet 11? Nothing much. We're left with some rough trade and our own imaginations, and who could ask for more than that? If Sonnet 12 does leave us wanting, though, just wait for Sonnet 12, because that is the natural foil to Sonnet 11, and I can't wait for you to join me with that next week. If you are enjoying these little talks that we have, bring some friends along next time. Tell your teachers. There's some crazy person who's talking about the sonnets just as you do, and we can make all one big happy family, and you can come and visit me in the Sonnetarium, because although visiting days are only on Thursdays, it's nice to have Tuesdays and Thursdays sometimes. But don't forget, as you go out into the world, beauty is in the particulars. The particulars are there in the world. The world is full of wonder. You'll never go anywhere if you don't pay attention. I'm Tootight Lautrec, and this has been the Shakey Sonnet Show. Mwah.